you. I got to start out with a shameless plug for Jimmy Hale Mission. Y'all, everybody been around here knows Jimmy Hale, and for most of our history, we were a hot cotton of prayer ministry. And right as COVID was starting, we began a complete overhaul of what we do. So now it is when you come here, you spend 4 months in intensive counseling, drug counseling, lifestyle counseling, and Christian counseling. You don't work. All you do is you're in class and you're working on your issues. Then you move into continuum, at which point, by the time you finish that in a year, you have a job, a place to live, a transportation plan, and a life plan. And we're seeing a graduation rate from when they come in to when they leave of about 65%, which is extraordinary when you're dealing with the population we're dealing with. And we're about to go into a major expansion where we're going to do this with our women's program. And we are also looking to get into owning and building and running graduate housing so that when people graduate. And so I'm very proud to do that. Yeah, as you mentioned, I spent 35 years in the mayor's office, and I always tell folks I've been clean 4 years working for Jimmy Hale. So, it was a joy working with Rowena for all the years she was in legal and I was at City Hall, and is great to connect back with Rowena. And it's a pleasure to be with y'all. I've always thought this was a really cool group. And then, we all have a connection to UAB. And so I urge everybody, 8:20 on Friday night, watch our beloved Blazers try to take out the Houston Cougars. Go Blazers. Ukraine. You can trace it back to the 10th century Viking settlement called the Kievan Rus, which created what we think of today as Slavic culture. In Kiev, on the bank of the Dnieper River, is a big statue of Vikings coming ashore in a longboat. And this is considered the birthplace of Slavic culture by both Ukrainian and Russian. The distinction there sometimes can be, very fine for people who don't know. The language difference, probably the closest example is Spanish and Portuguese. If you are listening to it and you know what you're listening to, you can tell immediately if somebody's speaking Russian or Ukrainian. If you don't, then it's much tougher. Ukraine has been independent. It has been part of the Russian Empire. It has been part of the Polish Empire. It has been part of Swedish conquested land. But since 1994, it has been a fully independent nation after the breakup of the Soviet Union. In 1994, there was what was called the Accords, which the UK, the United States, and Russia pledged to guarantee Ukrainians independence and sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine, which had inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, giving that nuclear arsenal up. And so they did a deal that they would be getting billions from the US and UK for development in exchange for giving all of their nuclear weapons to Russia. My first dealings in Ukraine were in '97, and my first dealing with some of their government officials, I said that may have been the worst deal in the history of mankind. They said, but we have the guarantees of the US for this treaty. And I said, well, you might want to get in touch with some of the Native American tribes and nations in North America to find out how treaties like that go between the US and UK. And we've seen that the Russians had no intent after the rise to power of Putin to honor that idea of sovereignty for Ukraine. When I was in the mayor's office, one of my major things I did was sister cities, our international stuff, international business. And we worked with the State Department quite a bit, particularly at the end of the Soviet period, because they wanted to have the emerging nations from the Soviet republics have connections with cities and governments and groups that could help them democratize. You had Bob Greene, Cumberland professor who helped write the Ukrainian Constitution. George Lieber, UAB professor, has been for many years working with the Ukrainian government on ways for them to democratize and modernize. And part of that in '97, we were made part of the Community Partners Program through USAID and the US Ukraine Foundation. And our work was in the Donbass and Donetsk Oblast and Lugansk Oblast, and primarily in a city called Krasnodon, but also with the capital city of Lugansk. And so this was a very tough area. In the 90s, the economic dislocation of the area was just remarkable to see. The best analogy I had for it is, imagine Appalachia during the Depression, but without the hope of a New Deal. And that was the Donbass. And the Donbass is primarily Russian speaking. In fact, all the TV stations you got were Russian speaking. And even though I'm the Ukrainian consul, I understand Russian much better than I do Ukrainian. So I try to not emphasize that. But when you're there for several months, you begin picking up the language. And the Donbass, one story to show how bad it was. Krasnodon is a city of mining. When you go into the town, it looks like you're coming into Egypt, and it looks like pyramids, but those are huge tailing piles from the coal mines. They have some of the deepest mines in the world, and their coal, though, is really not available to be exported to Europe because of its high carbon content. It's not clean coal. And so it was primarily exported throughout the former Soviet republics. The industry had fallen and unemployment officially was at 25%, but actually much higher than that. The Krasnodon, the situation was so bad that, particularly in that part of Ukraine, eastern part of Ukraine, the number 4 source of foreign income was women who went abroad to work as sex workers, sending back hard currency. It was an area that had really no hope. We were meeting, and they had a communist mayor, and he was not very interested in reform. But the miners had gone 6 months without being paid. And the mining company, which had been a state mining company, which had been taken over by some of the leaders who were in charge of the ministry of that, as it privatized, began to turn it into profit-making things for them. But they weren't paying the miners. And I had a miner ask at a meeting with their miners union, how long an American would work without being paid. And I said, no, if you miss a paycheck, you assume you don't work there anymore. And they thought that was funny. I said, no, that's actually how it's supposed to be. And at that time, they were rebuilding Kyiv and doing a lot of work in the western part. And so they were developing a great deal of resentment towards the western part of Ukraine. And in fact, when I report back to the embassy to staff that I knew were intelligence, I said, these people at some point are going to revolt. Well, we did things and to help them develop politically. They voted out the communists, but before they did that, a young man named Sergey, who I'd met, was father of a couple of kids, and the only income he had was selling bags of coal outside of his house because he hadn't been paid in 6 months. And his wife and family were hungry. And so they marched on the capital in Lugansk, the Oblast. And Sergey goes up to the steps of the Capitol, pours gasoline over his head, and sets himself on fire in protest. And he dies. The next week, all the miners got paid. And so that shows one of the systemic issues as Ukraine became independent was that there was a true difference between what was happening in parts of the country and some of the ethnic differences that you saw there. And the ethnic difference being basically linguistic, Ukrainian versus Russian. And the desperation of the people at that time. Thankfully, over the years, things have gotten much better. Even the Donbass, things got better. We saw some real successes from the programs we had and helped them implement. Then in 14, when you had the Maidan, the revolution to overthrow Yushchenko, Yanukovych, who had been elected president. He was very pro-Russian. His base was in the Donbass and in the eastern part of the country. And he was able to beat a very flawed candidate in the runoff. And then he began changing their orientations toward Russia. And one of my more interesting contacts at that time was in our sister city of Vinnytsia. We became sister cities with Vinnytsia because Pirogov Medical School and UAB Medical School did a lot of research together, a lot of cross-training. And so that became a source of a sister city for us here in Birmingham. But I will always remember you had Russian consultants everywhere after Yanukovych came into office. And it reminded me of one of the problems you saw in the Soviet Union was the fall of the Soviet Union corresponded with the end of the Reagan-Bush era. And you had a lot of unemployed free marketers and laissez-faire capitalists, libertarian capitalists who were looking for consulting work. And so the emerging governments there in the post-Soviet era were looking for Americans to tell them, how can we change our system? So they went in with the mantra of privatize, privatize, privatize. And so that's why everything ended up in the hands of oligarchs. In the Donbass, in Krasnodar, most of their assets were owned by a man who'd been a major in the Soviet Special Forces, Spetsnaz. And when everything fell apart, he had the wherewithal and the armament to take over businesses. And so it was that shock therapy that they had. One way to look at the change of the Soviet Union when that fell apart is imagine waking up one morning. Your money's no longer good. Your bank doesn't exist. Your country doesn't exist. You're told you have a different flag. You have a different set of laws and a different set of national heroes and stories. And that's what happened to these folks. And you drop into that, this idea of laissez-faire capitalism on people who had been comrades for 75 years. And what you end up was the nomenclatura, which is the party officials who had all the connections, ended up becoming the oligarchs. And people who were in charge of state-owned businesses ended up becoming oligarchs of those businesses. And so it was not a development of a capitalist system, but more of a kleptocracy. So when Yanukovych was in, one of my more memorable dinners I ever had was with a couple of Russian consultants there in Vinnytsia. And being Russian, they imbibed quite liberally during the dinner. And they got very talkative. And they said, you know, our plan is that we know we can't compete with the West. That was Gorbachev's problem. He thought we could compete with you. And you were able to break up the Soviet Union. You were able to press our differences, our ethnic ties, so that it fell apart. And he says, we've learned our lesson. We're going to bring you down to our level, and we're going to break you up. And our goal is to see the U.S. be several nations who don't get along and contentious, and it will bring you down to our level, and then we'll be able to succeed. And I laughed. And in retrospect, I really wish I could go back and apologize to these guys. But to show you the influence the Russians have in this country and things that they're doing, I'm just a little old volunteer honorary consul. Now, a couple years ago, I was told by the embassy to never go to Russia because they don't like me, which I consider a high compliment. But Facebook, one of the things that they're doing to people like me is that, and even just people who are expressing interest in Ukraine and support for Ukraine, like I know Rotary, they did this too, is they slam Facebook with complaints that you're posting inappropriate things until the algorithm knocks you off and you go in what's called Facebook jail. And one of my Ukrainian friends knows a lot of folks at Facebook, and I said, hey, you know, I haven't done anything. This is a Russian attack. And then finally yesterday, Facebook got hold of me, one of the person I was dealing with, and said, yeah, this looks like a Russian attack. And I said, well, I'm not the only one. This isn't the Lone Ranger. Y'all have a problem. Russia is controlling your algorithm to control who can say what on your algorithm. So when you're looking at some of the stuff, and there's very good evidence that about 40% of all the disinformation, all the fake news that you see on various social media platforms are originated from an FSB office in Moscow and their fellow travelers throughout the world, because they do have friends in this country in elected office who to this day are apologists. And one of the more interesting things is that you have some commentators on a network who are considered contributors to the Russian state media. So the two guys I had dinner with, I admire them for their honesty, and I really wish I could apologize for laughing in their face, because they've been able to accomplish just that to a great degree. So the Maidan, they overthrew Yanukovych, and that got Putin very angry. And what we're looking at here today is the result of 20 years of feckless and wishful thinking diplomacy on the part of our country with Russia. That there has not been a coherent policy recognizing that the man means what he says, and he says what he means about what he wants to do. His ultimate goal is reuniting all the Russian-speaking people, and also to turn the Arctic Sea into a Russian lake. They dropped a flag on the North Pole at the seabed because he wants the resources of it, and with the climate change, the Northwest Passage Henry Hudson and the guys never could find exists. And he intends to control that shortcut from Europe to Asia. And just as the Chinese hope to control the South China Sea, the shortcut from the Persian Gulf to Asia. So this is all part of a plan that he has said straight up. And like I said, we've had 1, 2, 3 administrations and a fourth who really have not taken it seriously. And before that, we had, from the time of the end of the Soviet Union, administrations that did not see this as an opportunity for us to use a Marshall Plan and remake the Soviet Union, but instead it became a way to embarrass the Russians and to push very questionable economic theories on countries that have absolutely no background in free enterprise or capitalism. So that all culminates with the Maidan, when the Ukrainian people rise up and throw out Yanukovych. His election also was kind of iffy too, particularly since you had polling places in the eastern part of the country that had 120% turnout. Love to vote even when they're not there. But so when he left, that got Putin into high gear. I remember I had two former interns working in the State Department, one on the Ukrainian desk. And I remember telling him that the Russians would invade Crimea the Wednesday after the Olympics. He says, oh, we have no intelligence for that. I said, well, my friends in the Crimea are telling me otherwise. And the Tatars are scared to death because they know that the Russians are not going to be mean to them as an ethnic and religious minority. And they scoffed. And then on the Wednesday after the Sochi Olympics, Russian tanks rolled in. I told him, I said, you look around the Olympics at Sochi, all you see are armored vehicles. It's a 3-hour drive to the Crimean border. Why are you not upset about this? And they weren't. So he drove in, and Ukraine was totally unready. In fact, the entire Ukrainian Navy switched sides. And so it was a very embarrassing thing. Putin paid no penalty for that. So later in the year, you had what's called the Little Green Men, which were Russian soldiers mixing with people in the Donbass who had some legitimate gripes about how they'd been treated. And they began an independence war in Lugansk and Donetsk, which has lasted to this day and is still one of the major fronts in the present war. So that was a Russian deal. The entire thing, the weaponry, the anti-aircraft weaponry that they had to neutralize the Ukrainian Air Force was Russian manned until it wasn't. When they put it in charge of the folks, basically the organized criminals and the thugs in Donbass and Lugansk, which became the governing group in the Donbass, you had the shoot down of the Malaysian aircraft because they had a Russian missile battery that was very sophisticated. It had a radar that would determine exactly what you were shooting at. They didn't know how to work that, but they were able to launch the missile, which then would track simply to the biggest, hottest target it could find. And so they saw a plane flying over. They said, it must be Ukrainian. They'd also been drinking. They fire off the missile and they bring down a Malaysian airliner. So you had that influx of weaponry, and the Ukrainians, to the amazement of everybody, fought them to a draw in the Donbass. Since 14, when the line stabilized, they've not changed more than a mile at any one time. So you had the run up to the present invasion, the present war. And once again, I was telling my friends, and this time the intelligence was saying the same thing, that the Russians were going to invade. And I said, once again, on the Wednesday after the Olympics, they will invade, because Putin had gone to see Xi, and they'd had their thing where the Chinese agreed to be unlimited friends with the Russians. And so the Wednesday after the Olympics, the tanks roll. And so what you have now is a Ukraine that is much better prepared than in 2014, which has been a great surprise to the Russians. The Ukrainians are a great advertisement right now for American Stinger anti-aircraft and Polish anti-aircraft missiles and the Javelin anti-armor missile. But also their ability to adapt to hit and run tactics that our special forces have trained them in for the last 8 years have pretty much fought the Russians to a draw thus far, particularly as regards the big cities. The Russian soldiers are horribly unprepared. Russian soldiers went in with MREs dated in 2002, well past their shelf life. They went in with inadequate logistical support for fuel, for food, for ammo. The scenes that you see of abandoned Russian vehicles that are being towed away by tractors are actually true. The Ukrainians have been able to replenish what losses they've had with armor by abandoned Russian equipment. So Putin has gotten into a war that he thought would be a walkover, but is not. And this is causing all sorts of issues within his command structure, but he has been able to isolate himself to the point where he believes his own propaganda. During COVID, he became very paranoid about it. And a man who normally went out and about a lot and was known to be an outdoorsman became very much the recluse. And physically, he has changed. If you look at pictures of Putin from 3 years ago to today, he's physically very different. And there's speculation as to whether or not he's on steroids for some disease, or that he's just been sitting around the house a lot. And he has a very limited number of people who talk to him, even more limited number of yes men that he's used to. So you have a leader who is very much out of touch with reality and hasn't shown much interest in getting into touch with reality, who is fighting a major war. The Ukrainians One of the things that he did starting in 14 was create an actual Ukrainian national identity. When I've been back since 14, that's one of the most remarkable things I've seen. Even people who are identify as Russian ethnically and linguistically fly Ukrainian flags. He overreached, thinking that he would be welcomed as a Mother Russia returning. And instead, he's been seen as a bully and a barbarian. And the present invasion has done nothing but increase the absolute resolve of the people to be there and to fight and to be involved in this and to not give up. So what we have here is the development of a standoff. The Ukrainians are not going to give up, and he is not going to give up either. So what we have here is a present situation that militarily is working its way to a stalemate. And this stalemate is leading us to the humanitarian issue. And that's one of the things I wanted to get to on this was the humanitarian issue. We are looking at one of the largest refugee situations in Europe since the Second World War. 2.5 million Ukrainian, primarily women, old folks, and children, have crossed the various borders, and with Poland being the #1 source for refuge. Seeing this, the Russians have attempted to create corridors for evacuation, all of which lead into either Belarus or Russia. And the Russians say, once you get there, you will be transported elsewhere. It is hard to imagine a more sinister statement than a Russian saying they're going to transport you somewhere else when you get here, when you look at their history. And the Ukrainians don't buy that, and they're not buying it. So you have the development of a huge humanitarian. The Russians are also using fairly primitive bombs. Some of y'all probably saw the disarming of the bomb on the street, where the guys were pouring water on the fuse as they were taking it out. If you look at that bomb was no different from what would have been dropped in World War II. It was a big, dumb iron bomb. It had none of the adaptations that you have for guided munitions that the Russians have and that we use almost exclusively. And they're either doing that because their advanced weaponry doesn't work, which may be true looking at what they've got, or they're saving it, or this is designed to have the maximum casualty and maximum terror value. When you drop a 500-pound bomb that you can pretty much be sure the block it goes, if not the building, then that is a terror weapon because you're hitting civilian targets. You're dehousing people. So it's a World War II tactic, basically. And the Russians have also, in their tactics, targeted hospitals and other infrastructure, so that if the war does not go their way, they have left Ukraine in a completely smashed state, so that transportation, services, housing are all trashed. So if they can't win, they intend to leave it as a mess. And so another thing that this has served that goes against their goals is that simply make the Ukrainians more willing to fight back. Locally, what are we doing? I was made in 2010, the then Ambassador Shamshir called me and asked if I'd like to be the honorary consul for Ukraine to Alabama because of all the stuff we had done. And I said, anything you ask, Mr. Ambassador, but I just have to ask, what does it do? He said, basically, you are our advocate in Alabama. If a Ukrainian has an issue, they can come to you, you coordinate with the embassy, you try to promote business, you try to promote culture. So over the years, we've done Ukrainian Independence Day celebrations, Ukrainian holiday celebrations. Our Independence Day celebrations, we do it in my church basement. So it's probably the only alcohol-free Ukrainian party you will ever go to. But it draws 200, 300 people every year we've done it. And for 12 years, I really tried to get people to pay attention to Ukraine. And so for the last 3 weeks, that has been quite easy. Numerous interviews, even the Washington Post yesterday is doing a story based on stuff that is happening here in Birmingham. And I never was able to get Ukrainian community as organized as I would have liked. One thing I did with the city is work with international communities here. So we're able to get a very organized Chinese American group, Caribbean American, and West African American groups that are very organized. But the Ukrainians were always skittish about accepting the Tocqueville view of Americans as people who form associations and committees to do things. The biggest change that I've seen is that they're involved and they're organized. We've become very well organized. We did a wonderful march on this past weekend, the rally that we've done, and we've got other things that we're planning on. So it has brought the community together and the community of people of Alabamians who have connections and love for Ukraine much closer together. To show you the volume, the embassy is, as you imagine, swamped. So I've received over 700 phone calls, texts, and emails from people regarding how to work with relatives who are trying to get out, how to help humanitarian-wise, and over 350 inquiries about how to join the Ukrainian military. You know, if you text me or email me, and I don't, well, the email I can tell what you're asking about, but the text, the phone calls, and then they'll leave a message. I have a canned response that shows the step by step how to join the Ukrainian military, and where we're suggesting people do their humanitarian charity. And then a little note, if this is not what you're calling about, text me back and with what you're calling about, because I simply don't have the time, because as I've been sitting here, my phone has rang twice, one from Pennsylvania, and the last one was from Washington State. And I'm sure these are people looking to join Ukrainian Legion. And I've actually gotten communication from people who are now in Ukraine and getting mustered into units. So it has been an extraordinary thing, and then working with people trying to help with their relatives. The US, we are not ready structurally, bureaucratically, or practically for the influx of any refugees. We don't have a policy set up yet. So that's one of the things that the local Ukrainian community is working on how to help people when they do get here, when we do get a policy as regards Ukrainian refugees. Right now, the American response is that they're trying to keep them in the countries near Ukraine, because the hope is that when this is over, they can get back and try to rebuild the country, which makes sense, to have them closer to Ukraine as refugees than to bring them here. But you also have a policy that is being put together where if you have a visa, a US visa, and you're Ukrainian, you can come in and you get a expedited work permit, and then in 2 years, an expedited review of permanent residency. So that is one of the things that we're seeing people who are able to escape. You know, and that has its ups and downs. One young woman who talked to the Washington Post yesterday about her story is a medical student at UAB, a resident, and she, her family was trapped in Kyiv. Her mother was able to get her 12-year-old daughter to the Polish border, and they actually have friends in Poland who were able to take them in. The Ukrainians are not letting men under 60 leave the country. If you try to leave, they turn you around, put you into a unit, and you get into the game. And so what we are seeing are a situation like Oksana's situation, where her daughter has a visa. Her grandmother who got her out does not have a visa. So she is now trying to work through the embassy in Warsaw, and is probably looking at 6 months before that paperwork will be able to go through. And that is actually quicker than the embassies usually work. So you have to give the US credit for that. But we are not set up right now for the humanitarian issues that are coming and are coming along on this. One of the things that I've had to get in, two things I've had to get in folks' mind in our local Ukrainian community is, one, this is going to be a long thing. If the war ends up being a guerrilla warfare, you're looking at years of war. Even if Putin leaves tomorrow, apologizes profusely, and has his forces leave, you're looking at years of displacement and trying to rebuild the country. So this is going to be a long-term slog for Ukraine. The other aspect of it is, I told them that Americans have a narrow attention span, that probably more people now could find Ukraine if pressed on a map than at any other time. But in 6 months, they're just as likely to forget where it is. And I've emphasized the need to have faces. And initially, we were getting all these things. They were saying, you talk to the media. Well, it doesn't help to have an Alabama guy talking about Ukraine. Yeah, I've got all these stories. I can say all these things. They need to hear a Ukrainian voice. And we're beginning to see that. At the march on Saturday, all 4 TV stations were there. The Ukrainians were telling their stories. They were interested. And the whole idea of getting out the word, putting a face to this so that the American public don't move on as rapidly as we've sometimes moved on when these things happen. So I've rambled on a bit. I'd really love if y'all got any questions.
Scotty, did you have a chance to hear the president of Ukraine this morning speaking to the Congress?
I was not. I was in on some work stuff, and so I really, did he do good?
Yeah, he was amazing. I mean, the guy is he's obviously first of all, very good speaker. Of course, there's some language problems, but very forceful. He seemed to hone in on a humanitarian corridor or humanitarian. He didn't ask for he didn't ask again for a no-fly zone, because he knows that's not going to happen. But he did ask for some kind of humanitarian fly zone, and I wasn't quite sure how that would work, since you can't really trust the Russians to anything that they say they're going to do anyway. So but it was a very good speech. He covered all the bases. He compared what I thought was interesting. He compared it to Pearl Harbor and 9/11, in the sense that he said that if you think that he says you Americans need to realize what it's like to have your airspace taken over by a foreign power, and like what happened in Pearl Harbor and like what happened in 9/11 can happen again to you. So he was trying to bring it back home to make us feel like we might be vulnerable too, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Well, and that adds to his Churchillian air he has developed about him. I've had the opportunity to know 2 Ukrainian presidents. His predecessor, Poroshenko, was from our sister city, and he owns the biggest chocolate manufacturer in Europe. And we got elected. I said, so Ukraine has elected Willy Wonka as president. And then on this one, Ukraine has elected a comedian. And then my Ukrainian friend said, well, at least he was a professional comedian. And so, but he has truly risen to the challenge. Just as it was said, Churchill weaponized the English language in the battle against the Axis. He has shown the physical courage and the eloquence to make people understand that this is a broader conflict between rising authoritarianism and the rule of law and democracy. And Ukraine has fought very hard to reform and create that rule of law. And they have a very healthy democracy. I always point out, almost no one wins re-election. That's a pretty good sign your democracy is pretty active. And so I was surprised at how well he was doing before this, and I am just really proud to see how he has been able to perform as a wartime leader.
Scotty, one of my concerns is the Russian tactic seems to be to surround the city, cut off their water, their food, their power, and starve them out. And I'm concerned that that cannot go on forever.
Yeah. And well, that's a tactic that goes back to when people were fighting with clubs of starving out your enemy. And they have encircled Mariupol, and it will be interesting to see how long Mariupol can withstand, because there's not a lot getting into Mariupol. Right now for Kyiv, the southern entrances are pretty open. The failure of the Russians to cut off lines of supply, to take out the Ukrainian Air Force in the first day, to cut off communications has been, it has boggled the mind of better military thinkers than I certainly am. It has been just such an amateurish thing. So yeah, Kharkiv is another good example. You're an hour and a half drive from the Russian border, and they still have not been able to close off Kharkiv. And so the longer we can keep getting ammo to the Ukrainians, and there's a lot of speculation that the Russian forces are beginning to show real signs of stress. That the problem with a siege is that you have a very large area you have to control and make airtight. And it doesn't look like they have the people able to do that. And one of the tactics that I'd hope we would do that you're seeing now, NATO is sending large contingents of ships off the Russian coast doing exercises. I think instead of getting directly involved, what we should be doing is NATO should be having huge exercises around Kaliningrad, the enclave between Lithuania and Poland. So we should make the Russians feel a little pressure. We should have the Pacific Fleet demonstrating off of Vladivostok and Sakhalin to show them that, hey, you've got a lot of undefended territory. During Beauregard and Civil War had a great thing, so hit them where they ain't. And if we can show them that, and particularly the generals who take real pride that nobody comes close to their borders, and we start messing with their borders, then I think that will start people thinking that this guy is taking us down a very bad path. And to give the Russian people credit, the last century, they were able to get rid of two sets of tyrants, the czars and the commissars. And so at some point, even the Russian people have shown a gag reflex for tyrants.
Scotty, I noticed that last week or so that the Canadian government had announced that they would be willing to take in a significant number of Ukrainian refugees. As I understand it, Canada has a significant number of Ukrainian people that have been there for generations. I noticed here, looking up at the number of refugees taken in by the United States last year, that we took in 11,411 total number of refugees. Poland currently has, what, 1.5 million refugees? Is there, when you talk of the problems the United States has in taking in refugees, you'd think that we could squeeze in a few more than 11,000 people. Is there any comment you have on this?
You have segued into my ask. And this is one of the things that I've been really pushing the local Ukrainian community and people saying, what can we do to help? And the biggest thing you can do to help on that is that, we say, okay, this is our issues on taking them in. These are all policy issues. They're not, and policy and logistics. But first off, policy. We have cut back on refugees over the last few years. We had an administration that did not believe there was such a thing as a refugee. And we've really not changed that very much with the new administration. The important blow that the average American can take is the old thing of you got to call, you got to write, you got to email, you got to bug your congressmen, your senators, send it to the White House. You know, I worked in City Hall for years. You'd be amazed how much 3 or 4 letters on an issue attention gets. So if all of y'all would make it a point to reach out to your elected representatives and say, hey, we need to begin addressing the very real crisis. Poland is to their breaking point. Moldova is not a big country. Slovakia is not a big country. Hungary has a short border with Ukraine. And they're not real big on refugees, but they're doing better than they have before. But at some point, we've got to give these people a safety valve so it doesn't become just permanent refugee camps on their borders. And that is where they have to hear from you, the American people, that not only are we willing to pay extra at the gas pump to hurt Russia, but we're willing to open up our houses and our communities to help bring in people who are displaced. And that's where, you know, that's the best, you know, as far as giving, I'm telling everybody, go to the website, usukraine.org, usukraine.org. They've worked with us for 25 years. They're very great advocates. They also have a list of specific things you can give to and charities that they're working with. So even if you want to give to the military, they have a link for that and every other aspect of humanitarian and medical and other relief. But the biggest thing as Americans can do, and the polling shows the American people are very much in favor of what we're doing to help Ukraine. But the biggest thing we can do, and the most important thing, is to keep the pressure on the government, the US government. They have to understand that it is not going to be thrown in their face of letting refugees in. And particularly if you're Republican, particularly if you're Democrat, you need to make that clear that this needs to be a nonpartisan issue of helping a democracy. That doesn't mean we're letting them in permanently, because, you know, I think in the end, Ukraine will be free again. It may look different, but there will be a free Ukraine. But we need to help the Europeans. We need to help our friends with this burden. And we need to show our class and our caring that we are known for and should be renewing why we're known for that.
We should be.
This is it, but let me finish. The Syrians were the first shot. That Russia wiped out the Syrians in exactly the same way. We have taken in Syrian refugees here in Birmingham, and there is a network set up. It started in Mobile. The Catholic refugee was the only group authorized at that time to take in refugees, but Birmingham now has an authorized pipeline. And there are several groups involved: the Muslim, the mosques, the Jewish community, the Presbyterian Church. And the main organizing group here is Alabama Interfaith Refugee Group. And I really believe that they can begin handling. They've got this pipeline going. They've had they take in about, right now, I think we have about 5 families we're working with. But so they're not geared up for thousands, but they are a start. And
Yeah.
I really
and
hope
then part of it is declaring the Ukrainians refugees, because right now they're still classed as displaced people.
Oh, we've got a bunch of those too. So, and we've got illegal refugees, illegal residents, everything else. So you name it. I'm assuming you know about it, and I hope you will, that you will join that group.
Yeah, that's one of the models that we're looking at, as well as, back in the 80s, the Jackson Bannock, when Jewish people were allowed to immigrate from the Soviet Union, and Birmingham took in a lot of those folks. And so that
Right.
we hope that we can do a similar thing with this.
Scotty, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the approach taken by that fellow at the Washington Institute. Her name is Anna Boshevskaya, and she offers the advice to the United States that if you want to have any effect on the Russians, you have to be active, not proactive, and you have to do this with force. Do you see that as a viable option?
That's where I come in, that I would really love to see NATO and our Pacific Fleet doing major exercises on our borders in order to show them that we got this stuff too. Growing up, I found that the best way to fight a bully is to hit them really hard when they least suspect it and let them know that that's coming again. The sanctions are hitting them hard, but the Russian military has to see that the West is actually mobilizing. And that's where I was very glad to see NATO has sent a 50-ship convoy off the Russian coast. But we also need to be doing like they were doing before the invasion when they were in Belarus. We need to have NATO doing major war games within hearing distance of the Russian bases in Kaliningrad. And the Russian Far East needs to see a lot of presence of aircraft carriers and F-35s.
I would say that you're right, but I would say I would be more aggressive. I think that Putin is using innuendo for using atomic weapons and for using chemical weapons, and that has paralyzed a lot of people to going past a certain point. And I think we ought to do what we did for the Berlin airlift. There was a lot of tension then, but we brought things in, we brought stuff in, and I think we should have an airlift, and we should we or NATO or whatever, bring in transport planes with or cargo planes with whatever is needed, food, clothing, weapons, and call their bluff.
Yeah.
And I don't think he wants to start a nuclear war. I really don't, but I think he's using that tactic of inserting the possibility of mutually assured destruction. But I don't think he really wants that. And he's just trying to bluff us. So call his bluff.
I would love to see the president do a day of photo ops, one on a Virginia class missile sub, another one by a B-52, and another one by an ICBM silo. Just a reminder, we got them too, Vlad, and we know where you live.
With the list that we've talked about, no one
cut off the
UN. Where is the UN in all of this?
Sidelines. I won't get into preaching too much, but I was on a Zoom with some UAB professors with the Peace Institute. And one of the points I made is that peace is very well to talk about, international law is very well to talk about, but when you're in the middle of a crime scene, you really don't start talking about how to negotiate. You don't really talk about how to change the rules. You have to deal with the actual violence at hand. And the UN is once again showing that structurally it has absolutely no ability to influence, particularly a Security Council member. That they can pass resolutions, but I'm reminded of Napoleon when the Pope told him he couldn't do something, and he asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? And the UN can tell Putin that they don't want him to do something, and he will ask, how many divisions does the UN have?
how about the fact that they have closed off Mariupol? Russia shut down the only route that they opened, supposedly, and they shut it down immediately from Mariupol.
Yep.
And they're not letting Doctors Without Borders in.
Yeah, Mariupol is
Period.
the question on the
So,
siege earlier.
how do you do
Mariupol
that?
is the first city to be actually in a siege. And Mariupol is a small enough city. Mariupol is about 150,000, probably less than that right now. And it is on the sea, so you're only having to basically cover 3 corners of the city because they control the sea completely.
Well, they opened the border. I mean, they opened a corridor, and then it was a trap.
Yeah, the corridor took you into
Sure.
Russia, where they would kindly transport you somewhere.
They, what about the atomic issue?
You know,
Nuclear war.
since the Russians exploded their first bomb, you know, we've been in an era of MAD, mutual assured destruction. And both of us have at different times, you know, rattled our saber on that. But I will tell you the real lesson on atomic energy that this war gives us, and that if you're a nation with atomic weapons, you should never, ever, ever give up all your weapons. If you are a nation that is being threatened by your neighbor, you should build atomic weapons. And that goes against, you know, what we like to think of as the policy we're trying to do, and peace. But one thing, you know, one thing the world learned from the end of Saddam Hussein is that if he'd had a few nukes, he'd still be in power. If Gaddafi had a few nukes, he'd still be in power. And Kim Jong-un learned that very well. And if the Ukrainians had kept half a dozen missiles, this would have never happened. And that's the sad part of it, is that MAD, instead of becoming less of a strategy, to me now becomes the only logical strategy for any country that's being menaced or has even a few nukes, is that you don't give them up. That's not the lesson we wanted to do. That's not what we should have made as the lesson. That's the lesson the world has learned.
That's the bad part, and that's the truth.
Well, I think we've reached our time, I have truly enjoyed talking to y'all and being part of this. When I was very thrilled when Mary asked. I've always thought Horizons is a good group. And once again, my shameless plug, Jimmy Hill Mission, give to us, because we're about to do some really cool things. You're gonna hear some cool stuff from us. And if you're looking for a way to help Ukraine charity-wise, usukraine.org. I highly endorse them. I'm full disclosure, I'm on the member of the board for US Ukraine, and they've been working with us here in Birmingham for 25 years. And bug your elected representatives so that they don't forget, and then bug them that this country needs to step up and help on the humanitarian aspect of this. And I like the idea of a modified no-fly zone, a humanitarian no-fly corridor.